In early March of 2022, 70-year-old Abigail Norris was feeling good as she walked out of the Newark, New Jersey airport. It was chilly outside, but she didn't mind. She'd just spent 9 weeks at a friend's house in Southern California. Every day had been filled with sunshine and strolls along the beach. It was the most relaxing winter of her life. Even her chronic back pain felt better in the mild weather. For decades, Abigail had suffered joint pain from osteoarthritis, and she also had lower back pain that made it hard to even comfortably sit upright, let alone move around. But considering how well she felt right now, she was starting to think that maybe she should just go to California every winter. 3 months later, Abigail woke up suddenly in the middle of the night with a sharp pain in her stomach. She fumbled for the lamp on her bedside table, flicking on the light just as another stabbing pain hit her. She groaned and curled up into the fetal position until the room started spinning. Then a wave of nausea hit her, and she hurried to the bathroom just in time to lean over the toilet to vomit. And she would vomit into that toilet bowl over and over again until she was coughing up this yellowish-green bile that came from her liver. And every time she felt like she was done throwing up, another wave of nausea would hit and she would throw up again. It was actually Abigail's third vomiting fit in the past few months. She'd gone to the emergency room the last 2 times, but the doctors didn't know what was wrong. Both times, the pain went away on its own and she was discharged. She had no idea what was causing these symptoms. At first, she wondered if maybe this was some awful side effect of a migraine, which are very severe, debilitating headaches. She used to suffer from them all the time, but they never affected her gut or made her this violently ill. And this particular vomiting spell was the worst one so far. More than an hour passed by before Abigail felt certain she was done throwing up. By then, she felt weak and shaky, and the pain in her abdomen was becoming unbearable. Abigail gathered her strength and managed to get herself dressed. She found her purse and staggered out to her car. Even though she feared it would be another waste of time, she knew she had to get to the hospital again. The next morning, Abigail was laying in a hospital bed, vomiting yet again, but this time into a disposable bag. She had been admitted to the hospital, and then an ER doctor had ordered blood and urine tests along with a CT scan of her abdomen. While waiting for the results, he gave her medication for her pain. He also started her on broad-spectrum antibiotics in case she had a bacterial infection. But none of it helped with her stomach cramps and nausea or the vomiting. Abigail could not stop puking even though her stomach was completely empty. She was exhausted and her stomach hurt so badly that when she wasn't throwing up, all she could do was lie in bed with her eyes closed. Just then, Abigail heard someone come into the room, but she felt too weak to open her eyes. A nurse asked her if she wanted more pain medication. Abigail just shook her head and said no. The pain medication they had given her in the emergency room had not helped, so there was no point in taking any more. Besides, Abigail felt like she'd just throw up anything they put in her system, so she'd rather tough it out and let her stomach rest. Later that morning, when Dr. Howard Pinter entered his new patient's room, Abigail's room, he was hit with the stench of fresh vomit. The acid smell lingered in his nose as he approached her. Abigail lay motionless on the bed, her eyes closed. She looked too weak to move. Her face was pale and glistened with sweat. The hair around her face was soaked through and matted to her forehead. It was clear she'd had a long and sleepless night. Dr. Pinter said her name, and he watched as her eyes fluttered weakly, but she didn't say anything. He realized this was likely the closest thing to a hello that she could muster. He asked her if she could tell him where the pain was coming from, but all Abigail could do was make this low moaning noise, as though talking took too much work. So, Dr. Pinter began an exam, and he pressed gently on her abdomen, asking if that made the pain worse. If he could figure out exactly where the pain was coming from, it would help him diagnose her. But Abigail didn't even seem to notice his hands on her, so he just continued to press up and down on her belly, trying to pinpoint the origin of her pain, but she didn't react to anything he was doing. Her entire abdomen was apparently throbbing in pain, but him pressing on her abdomen made no difference to her. Because her pain was so widespread, the doctor knew he could probably rule out conditions like appendicitis or kidney stones, which tend to show up in one specific place. But there was a laundry list of other conditions that could cause abdominal pain like this, and so Dr. Pinter hoped that the true cause would show up either on her CT scan or her lab work. An hour later, Dr. Pinter sat at his desk looking over Abigail's blood test results as well as images of her abdomen from the CT scans. On these scans, he couldn't see anything that would cause pain throughout the entire region, but something seemed to be wrong with the quality of the images. He looked through her medical records, and he quickly found an explanation. Abigail had had a small device called a nerve stimulator implanted in her abdomen years ago to help treat her chronic migraines. It worked by sending electric pulses to her nervous system to alter the way her brain experienced pain. However, since the device was electronic, the interference from it was reducing the picture quality of her CT scans, which made it hard for Dr. Pinter to pinpoint the cause of Abigail's stomach pain. But the scans were not the only thing that troubled the doctor. There was also her lab results to consider. Her white blood cell count was extremely high, which suggested she was fighting off an infection or inflammation. And the doctor saw yet another problem too. When body tissue does not receive enough oxygen, it begins to die and releases an acid into the bloodstream. Abigail had a rising level of this acid in her system, which meant that some of her tissue could already be dying. Dr. Pinter worried that she might have a condition called ischemia, which occurs when the supply of blood to the organs is cut off. This condition can lead to a heart attack or stroke. Unfortunately, the CT images were not good enough to identify any blockage in the blood supply that could be causing ischemia. However, Dr. Pinter knew he had no time to lose. He grabbed his phone and called down to the cardiology department and scheduled Abigail for emergency surgery later that afternoon. He needed a vascular surgeon to literally open up her abdomen and look to see if something was blocking her circulation and also to remove any dying tissue. A few hours later, Dr. Pinter received a call from the surgeon who had performed Abigail's procedure. The good news was that Abigail came through the surgery just fine. Her organs looked perfectly healthy and her blood vessels were functioning properly. She did not have ischemia. In fact, it looked like there was nothing wrong with her arteries at all. Dr. Pinter was glad to hear that Abigail looked healthy, but in reality, she was still very sick with something, and now he had no idea what could be causing these stomach cramps, the high white blood cell count, and the rising level of acid in her body. What he really needed was to get Abigail strong enough so she could speak. That way she could answer questions about her pain and her previous vomiting spells. Without her talking, he feared they'd never get to the bottom of her issue. Three days later, around lunchtime, Abigail was eating some Jell-O in her hospital bed. Until this point, she'd been getting her nutrients through an IV. This was the first true meal she'd had since she arrived at the hospital, and if it were up to her, it was going to be the last. She just wanted to go home. That morning, the pain in her abdomen had finally subsided. She'd stopped vomiting and could now keep fluids down. For the first time in days, she actually felt hungry. It was like her illness had disappeared. And her updated lab results seemed to support that idea. Her blood and urine showed no signs of an infection. And so, just like the last two times Abigail had a very serious vomiting and cramping spell, it seemed like everything just sort of went back to normal. The medical staff didn't have an explanation for why she was suddenly better, and so Abigail felt like she was just wasting time and money by staying in the hospital. But a moment later, Dr. Pinter appeared in the doorway, and he told Abigail that he might have an explanation for her pain. Abigail was surprised, but intrigued, and asked him to explain. Dr. Pinter said he had two theories. The first was that she might have a rare nerve condition called abdominal migraines. He explained that when Abigail first arrived at the hospital, he had pressed a hand on her stomach to see where the pain was coming from. That's what made him think that she might be suffering from nerve pain, one of the few types of pain that does not respond to pressure. Plus, Abigail had a history of regular migraines, and he explained that abdominal migraines are related to migraine headaches, but they show up as abdominal pain, nausea, and vomiting, rather than the more typical headaches. Dr. Pinter said the other possible theory for what was causing her pain was that she could be suffering from abdominal epilepsy, a very rare type of seizure that causes severe abdominal pain. It's most common in children, but adults can suffer from it as well. And so he asked her if she wouldn't mind staying at the hospital long enough to let the neurology team examine her. Abigail admitted that Dr. Pinter might be onto something, but she just could not spend any more time in the hospital. So she made a deal with him. If he discharged her, she would book an appointment with the neurologist who had been treating her migraines over the past 20 years to see if maybe he thought either of those theories were what was going on with her. Dr. Pinter said they had a deal. The following day, Abigail was home and she sat down at the desk in her bedroom. she logged onto a Zoom call for a meeting with her neurologist, Dr. Randall Bergen. Dr. Bergen was not just a neurologist, he was also a psychiatrist, and he had been Abigail's doctor for over 2 decades, though she hadn't seen him in a long time. When her nerve stimulator was implanted a few years ago, her migraines had cleared up almost completely, so there really hadn't been a need to speak to him. But now, she told him all about her vomiting spells and Dr. Pinter's theories that maybe she had abdominal migraines or seizures. She also told him about her blood tests, CT scans, and exploratory surgery. None of the doctors could find evidence of anything physically wrong with her. And finally, she told him how her pain just suddenly went away after a few days in the hospital. And she said the same thing had happened twice before since coming back from California. Dr. Bergen was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking over all the information. Then, he asked her a question that nobody had thought to ask her before. Dr. Bergen wanted to know if Abigail smoked marijuana. Abigail was surprised. She assured him that she had never smoked marijuana, but she had eaten it. When she was in California, Abigail's friends kept telling her that weed gummies could help with her chronic back and joint pain, and so she'd given it a try. And sure enough, the gummies had really helped. Whenever she ate a gummy, it was so much easier to move and walk around or even just do housework. So, ever since she got home from California, she'd been eating 6 weed gummies a day. When she was in the hospital, she hadn't told Dr. Pinter about the weed gummies because she was embarrassed. Besides, the gummies were supposed to reduce nausea, so she didn't think it was relevant anyways. That's when Dr. Bergen explained that Abigail was suffering from something called cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. It's caused by prolonged use of high-dose cannabis and is characterized by nausea, vomiting, and abdominal pain. Researchers don't know why some people have this reaction to the chemicals in marijuana, but it's thought that the intolerance could be genetic. The good news was that if Abigail discontinued her use of the weed gummies, her painful vomiting spells would stop. And in fact, that's what was happening each time she was hospitalized. She didn't have access to marijuana gummies, and so after a couple of days, the pain would subside. However, the weed gummies made Abigail's life so much better that at first, she actually really didn't want to stop using them despite the downside. So she tried lessening the dosage and the frequency, but still, she would get violently ill and have stomach pains, and so eventually she did stop taking them altogether. And while her lower back pain and osteoarthritis did come back, she at least stayed out of the hospital and has not experienced pain or nausea since. And now here's our second story called A Spoonful of Sugar. On a warm spring afternoon in 2011, a woman named Brooke Scott arrived at her lively real estate office in Massachusetts with a box of warm chocolate chip cookies for her staff. Brooke walked from cubicle to cubicle, handing out cookies and patting people on the back to celebrate a huge sale for that month. But when Brooke arrived at the cubicle belonging to an agent named Kelly Romano, she stopped short. Normally, 52-year-old Kelly had the energy of a woman half her age, constantly chatting with clients and combing through the latest listings. Today, though, Kelly was hunched over in her chair. Her face was pale and slick with sweat, and she stared at the box of cookies in Brooke's arms with glassy eyes. Kelly reached for one of the cookies, but when she stood up, she swayed back and forth before her knees buckled and she sank back into her chair. Brooke just shook her head. She couldn't smell any alcohol in Kelly's breath, but it was clear. Kelly was drunk in the office. Again. Brooke whispered to Kelly that they had talked about these day-drinking episodes several times over the past year, but Kelly insisted she was sober, and Brooke was making a big deal out of nothing. But Brooke had had enough. She told Kelly to take some time off, and then picked up the phone to call her a ride home. The following day, Kelly went out to run errands with her husband Peter. She still didn't feel quite right, but she was sure the time off would help. As they drove through town, her cell phone rang. It was one of her clients, asking her to set up an appointment to go see a house he wanted to buy. Kelly promised she would set it up. However, the moment they hung up, she completely forgot what property they'd been talking about. Kelly felt rattled by this. She never forgot details like that. So she promised herself she would call that client back once she was feeling less fuzzy. An hour later, Kelly and her husband Peter had finished their grocery shopping and were loading their bags back into the car. Peter needed to make some calls, so Kelly hopped in the driver's seat and pulled out of the parking lot. and after a few minutes, Peter put his phone on mute and looked over at her, and with a confused look on his face, asked Kelly where she was going. Kelly looked around and realized she didn't know where she was. Now, she still knew how to drive. She could tell a red light from a green light. But when she tried to remember the way home, she couldn't. She felt like a lost child. At this point, Kelly knew something was definitely wrong. This was not just brain fuzziness. So she pulled the car over, and she and her husband switched spots. And as she slumped into the passenger seat, Peter looked over at her with concern. He asked her if she knew what year it was, or who was the president of the United States. Kelly knew this was a standard way to check someone's cognitive abilities, and she felt a pang of terror as she realized she didn't know the answers to either of Peter's questions. All of a sudden, Kelly could barely focus at all. She felt like her brain was being flicked on and off like a light switch. And then, her mind went completely blank. Suddenly, Kelly opened her eyes back up. She realized she was lying down in her kitchen. She had no idea how she'd gotten there. She looked over and saw Peter crouched next to her, and then she also realized she was surrounded by paramedics. Peter told her she'd been acting strange the entire way home, and when they went to put their groceries away about 15 minutes ago, Kelly had just collapsed, and so Peter had called 911. Kelly nodded, confused, and then just tried not to move while the paramedics checked her vitals. Also, one of them pricked her finger to test her blood sugar levels, and after checking, he told her that her blood sugar was very low, a condition called hypoglycemia that can cause confusion and dizziness. Kelly asked if they were going to take her to the hospital now, but one of the paramedics just shook his head. He said that she should be fine as soon as she got her blood sugar elevated again. So he helped her sit up and then handed her a little package of jelly beans to eat. After a few minutes of eating them, Kelly was feeling better. Before the paramedics left, they told her to always keep some fast-acting carbohydrates like juice or candy on hand for whenever she felt lightheaded or woozy. Even though Kelly was still totally shocked by what had just happened to her, she was grateful to know what was actually wrong with her. This was hypoglycemia. However, she had to figure out why she became hypoglycemic. A few days later, Kelly sat across from her doctor, hoping for a plan or some sort of medicine to keep these episodes from happening to her again. Aside from these episodes being terrifying, she also just couldn't afford for people to think she was drunk all the time. The doctor explained that most likely, her body was making too much insulin, the hormone that regulates the amount of sugar flowing to the cells, especially the brain. Insulin is very important, but too much of it can pull too much sugar out of her bloodstream, robbing cells of their fuel. And so her brain didn't have the energy it needed to help her remember things or talk, and she didn't have the strength to stand up. That's why she was passing out in the middle of the day like she was drunk. But when the doctor looked over her most recent blood test, he was surprised. He told her that her insulin levels were slightly elevated, as if she had just eaten, even though she hadn't. But he told her to just keep an eye on it and keep an emergency stash of jelly beans on hand, just in case her blood sugar plummeted again. More than a year later, Kelly's husband, Peter, paced around his office with his phone to his ear. He was trying to reach Kelly at work, but she wasn't answering her office line. He had left her 4 messages in the past hour, and he was getting worried because she hadn't called him back. He sighed in frustration as his call went to voicemail again, and he left message number 5. Over the past 12 months, Peter had helped Kelly manage her low blood sugar. He stocked the fridge with juice boxes and made sure there were always packs of her favorite candy in her purse. He knew his wife was not happy with the 25 extra pounds she had gained from all the extra sugar, so he made sure they always went for a walk together before work. Peter knew Kelly was doing her best to keep her struggles from her colleagues, and for a while, it had worked. She didn't have any more of those low blood sugar moments when her colleagues thought she was drunk. But lately, Peter had noticed her low blood sugar moments were getting more frequent, and Kelly had to eat more and more sweets to snap out of them. And so that's why he had gotten into the habit of calling her at work every afternoon to check in on her. After still not hearing back from his wife, Peter decided to call the front desk at Kelly's office and ask the receptionist to check on Kelly. The receptionist said she could actually see Kelly right now sitting at her desk, and from the looks of it, it seemed like Kelly was sort of talking to herself. Peter's stomach immediately sank because this sounded like the start of an episode. But the receptionist told him there was a bottle of apple juice on Kelly's desk, and at that, Peter brightened. It sounded like his wife had the situation in hand. As long as she drank the juice, she would be fine. He thanked the receptionist and hung up, feeling a bit relieved, but still wanting to talk to Kelly that night to make sure she really was okay. But when Peter got home that night, he found Kelly stumbling around their kitchen, slurring her words. And so immediately Peter jumped into action. He held a glass of orange juice to her lips, and after a moment, she kind of came back to herself. And once she had recovered, he insisted this had gone on long enough. They both agreed Kelly needed to see a specialist. A week later, Dr. Frank Miller listened as Kelly described her embarrassing episodes and the constant suspicion that she was drunk at work. Dr. Miller was an endocrinologist, which is a doctor who specializes in hormone disorders. Dr. Miller swiveled his chair to the computer screen to take a look at her blood work, and he saw that her blood contained an amount of insulin that was normal for someone who had just eaten. However, Kelly had taken the test on an empty stomach. Dr. Miller double-checked with Kelly, and she insisted that really, she hadn't eaten anything and only had sips of water for the 12 hours before she took this blood test. Dr. Miller looked at the results again. Kelly's pancreas, the organ that makes insulin, was busily doing its job, even though there was no sugar in her body to process. Dr. Miller thought he might know what was wrong with Kelly. He explained that he wanted to run one more test to confirm his suspicions. But this test would involve more than just another vial of blood. The test was called an endoscopic ultrasound. He explained that he would guide a long, flexible tube fitted with a special instrument down her mouth and into her digestive system. He would wind it through her body until it landed near her pancreas. Then he would take a good look and tell her what he found. By the look on Kelly's face, Dr. Miller knew the thought of him snaking a tube through her insides made her uncomfortable. But he assured her she would get through the procedure just fine. And she would. When she awoke from the procedure, Dr. Miller was happy to report that he'd located the reason for her last few years of misery. The endoscopic ultrasound showed a blob the size of a pencil eraser on Kelly's pancreas. This blob was a benign tumor called an insulinoma, which was made of cells that produce insulin. Normally, the body tightly controls how much insulin the pancreas makes, but the cells in this tumor pumped out insulin constantly, whether the body needed it or not. And so all that extra insulin kept her blood sugar low no matter how much sugar she consumed. In 2013, the tumor was successfully removed. Kelly's life went back to normal. She stopped needing to eat so many sweets, she was able to lose the extra weight she'd put on, and the rumors of her day drinking were finally put to rest. In 1955, Catherine Knight had the misfortune of being born into a highly dysfunctional and abusive household. Not only was she badly mistreated by her alcoholic parents and cruel older siblings, she was also scorned by the people who lived in the town with her simply because they didn't like her family. Catherine lived in a very small town in New South Wales, Australia, where basically everybody knew each other's business. But despite the abuse, Catherine always tried to focus on the future. She would tell herself that as much as my life is miserable right now, in the future I will have a family of my own and I will take care of them the way I wish my family had taken care of me. But when Catherine became a young woman and began dating men, all of her relationships would always crash and burn because inevitably she and her partner would become toxic and abusive and it would end the relationship. It was like Catherine both didn't know how to be a quality partner and didn't know how to identify a quality partner, likely because she didn't know what that looked like. She had been raised in this horrible household. But in 1995, when Catherine was 40 and really starting to feel desperate for someone to actually love and to love her back, she would meet a man named John Price, who was also 40, and he just seemed fundamentally different than every other man she had ever dated. He was empathetic to her troubled past, and he seemed to really care for her and really wanted to kind of take her under his wing and love her. And so immediately Catherine just fell head over heels in love with John, and in return it seemed very much like John had fallen head over heels in love with Catherine. That year, Catherine moved in to John's house where he lived with his 3 young daughters, who right away took a liking to her. And so for the first time, Catherine felt like her life was really going the way she wanted it to go. But unfortunately, this would not last. Despite the seemingly perfect start to Catherine and John's relationship, it eventually began to sour when Catherine began to ask John if they were ever going to get married. Catherine really wanted to get married. She wanted to kind of officially have a family of her own that she could take care of, but John was weary of marriage because he had just left a failed marriage, and he told Catherine that realistically he might never want to get married again. And so over time, this issue really drove the two apart, and it all came to a head in early February of 2000 when John and Catherine were at his house. They were in the kitchen and they got into a heated fight over marriage, and then before long they were both getting physical with each other. And during this altercation, Catherine kind of scrambled and grabbed a knife on the counter and actually slashed John across the chest. And as soon as she did this, the fight came to an end. John screamed at her to leave the apartment and never come back, but Catherine was already storming out of the apartment. They both understood that a line had been crossed, and almost certainly their relationship was now over. But over the following days and weeks, Catherine, who had moved into a different apartment at this time, kind of near where John was living, she felt very lonely, and even though she knew her relationship with John was not a healthy one, she longed to patch things up with him. She didn't like being alone. She wanted to have that family. And so she decided she would do what she had previously done in other relationships to kind of patch up the relationship after a fight. And so the way she would do this is she would kind of make sure they had the house to themselves, and then she would show up in lingerie and they would have kind of an intimate makeup moment, and then everything would go back to normal. So on February 29th, Catherine waited until she knew John had left for work, and she went over to his place, and she had a key to it still, and she went inside and his 3 daughters were there. And so Catherine said hello, and she chatted with the kids for a minute, and then she made arrangements for the 3 kids to go get picked up by a babysitter and spend the night outside of the house. And so then when the babysitter came by the house and picked up the 3 girls, Catherine said goodbye to them, and then Catherine left John's place and she went out to get her lingerie. Later in the evening, when John came back to his house, he went inside and he found his kids weren't there, but there was a note from Catherine that explained where his kids were and how she wanted to make up with him and she would be back in a little while. Now, John was not happy about this. He was angry that she had decided to just come into his house without asking him. That felt very violating. And then also she made a decision about his kids without talking to him. That just felt so offensive and wrong of her to do. And so John grabs a beer out of the fridge, he sits down in the living room, and he begins to wait for Catherine to show up. The next morning at 6 a.m., John was supposed to be at work already, but he wasn't. And so his company, who knew he was very reliable, were concerned something was wrong. And so they sent a worker to his property to see what was going on. And so the worker, he pulls up in front of John's house. John's car is in the driveway. And so the worker's first thought is, oh, I guess John must have overslept. And so the worker walks up onto John's front porch and he knocks on John's front door, but there's no answer. And so the worker knocks again, still no answer. And so this guy turns around to leave and go back and tell the company, look, I don't know what's going on. But as he's turning around, he notices on the very bottom of the outside of the door, kind of near the edge, the front edge of this door, there looked to be some blood on the outside of the door. It was pretty easy to tell it was blood. And so the worker was immediately very concerned and he knocked again on the door, but no answer. And so he ran around to the side of the building and he began banging on the windows of John's house to hopefully rouse whoever was in there to come out and to make sure things were okay, but there was silence. And so the worker ran back to his car, he drove back to his office, and after he told his boss what he had found, they decided they had to call the police. The police would show up at John's residence at 8 a.m., and when they got there, John's vehicle was still in the driveway, the house was quiet and dark, and so the police, they walked up to the front door, they knocked on the door, there's no answer, it's silence, and so they walk around to the back of the property to try the back door, and as they're walking into the backyard, they see in the middle of the grass, right behind a window that led into the house, there was this plate of food that had been clearly thrown out of the house and landed face down on the grass. And so the police see that, they're thinking that's pretty weird. And so what they do first, before even going to the back door, is they turn to the window, which clearly the food had been thrown out of, but whoever had done it had then shut the window. And so they go over to the glass and press their faces up against it and peer inside. And there's no John, there's no people, there's nothing inside, it's dark. But right inside of this window is this big dining room table, and it's covered with this amazing spread of food. It looks like a Thanksgiving Day meal had been prepared, but then no one had eaten from it. And so they're thinking, okay, well, for whatever reason, one of these plates of food was thrown out the window. That's very odd. And so the police come off the window, they walk over to the back door, they knock a few more times, but after even more silence, they kick the back door down and they go inside. As soon as they step in, there's two officers. They walk straight into the house with the dining room table with all that food on their left, and there's nothing that stands out. They're calling for John, it's silent, everything is off, everything is quiet, and they keep on walking into what appears to be the living room where the TV is and where there's a couch, and as soon as they walk in, they see there's blood everywhere. And towards the front of the living room, where the front door actually opened into the house, there was a very obvious pool of blood. Basically, if you stepped into the house, you'd be stepping into this puddle of blood. And as they're looking at this pool of blood, they see there is a distinct blood trail from the pool back into the living room that they have just walked into, and the trail kind of leads behind a couch out of their view. And so they walk around the couch to see what's at the end of this trail, and they find Catherine Knight's crumpled body on the ground. And so right away they rush over to her and they feel for a pulse, and they discover that she actually does have a pulse, but very obviously she's clinging to life, barely. And so one of the officers stays with Catherine while they're calling in paramedics to come in and deal with her, while the other officer draws their weapon and they begin searching the rest of the house. And so the officer walks past the front door on their left, and they go into the other side of the first floor, which is basically like this lounge room, kind of like a secondary living room. And as they're looking out across this room, they see there's no one in it, but there appears to be this curtain blocking the entrance to some other side room. And this officer, as they're looking at it, they look down and they notice there's another blood trail that starts from the front of the house. It snakes all the way across this lounge room and kind of disappears into this covered up room. And so this officer yells out for John, but there's no answer. And so he ends up going all the way across, checking as he's going, looking around, but there's no one there. And he gets to this towel, and with his non-shooting hand, he kind of pushes it out of the way, and he looks inside of this space. And it turns out to just be a small closet. There was nothing of note inside. It didn't really make sense that the blood trail had led to this closet. But then, as the officer was kind of wondering why the blood trail ended here, he started to feel something cold on his non-shooting arm. And so he looked down at his arm and he saw there was this huge streak of blood on his arm. And he knew he had not been wounded in some way. This was not his blood. So how did he get blood all over him? And then he stepped back in horror because he realized the curtain that he had just moved with the arm that had blood on it was not a curtain. The night before, John sat in his living room waiting for Catherine to return, very angrily waiting for her to come back. But by 11 p.m., she hadn't. And John, he works super early in the morning. He's very tired. He decides to just go to bed. And so he climbs into bed. He falls asleep. And then about an hour or so later, Catherine would walk into the bedroom. She had her black lingerie on that she had bought earlier in the day. And even though John was furious with her and very upset with what she had done that day, seeing her like this suddenly made him think, you know what, all my issues with her can wait. And before long, they were getting intimate together in the bed, and then they fell asleep in each other's arms. Later in the night, Catherine would wake up. John's still fast asleep, so she's looking right at him, and she suddenly has this intense sense of disgust. She was convinced that he was taking advantage of her, that the reason he didn't want to marry her was he was just kind of using her. And this anger inside of her boiled up, and she decided right then and there that I need to teach this man a lesson he will never forget. And so Catherine very quietly slipped out of the bed. John's still sleeping. She snuck out of the bedroom. She made her way out of the house, and she got into her car, and she drove across town to the apartment she had been staying in for the past couple of weeks, and she grabbed her work tools. Catherine, where she worked full time, was a meat processing processing factory, and she worked on the kill floor with the animals that are being turned into meat. And so her skill set was butchering, and her tools were butcher's knives. And so she grabs her kit of butcher's knives, and she drives back to John's place. She goes into the house, she makes her way into the kitchen, and she unrolls this kit full of different sized butcher knives, and she picks the one she wants, she pulls it out, she makes sure it's nice and sharp, and then she made her way into John's bedroom. When she got into his bedroom, John was still asleep. He was lying on his back, covers up over him, fast asleep, and she climbed onto the bed, being very careful not to wake him. And then when she was straddling him kind of on her knees right over his midsection, she raised the knife up between her two hands and she brought it down into his chest. John immediately shot up, bucking Catherine off of him. She went flying onto the floor, and then instinctively John just begins running out of his bedroom. He has no idea what's happening. He's been stabbed, but he probably can't even feel it. It's all adrenaline. He is just running through the house. But by the time he gets to the front of the house, the blood loss had caused him to be so weak he could barely stand. And so he managed to open the front door, but then he collapsed onto the ground halfway between the inside and outside of the house. And so laying there, he reached out with his bloody hand and he grabbed the edge of the door that was partially open and tried to pull himself out of the house. And that's how that bloody print was left on the outside of the door that the worker saw. And as he's trying to pull himself out of the house, Catherine, who had gotten up after being knocked off the bed, she ran to the front of the house and she grabbed his legs and she pulled him back into the house and then shut the door. And then once he was inside, she got on top of him and stabbed him an additional 36 times all over his body. And then she left him there to bleed to death. And so while he's dying, she goes into the kitchen and she puts on a large pot of water to boil. And then she began setting the plates all around the dining room table for a big family meal. After she was done setting the table, she went back over to John, who was now deceased at this point, and she dragged him all the way across that lounge room on the other side of the house that the officer walked through and then found that curtain. She dragged him all the way across that room to right in front of that closet, and then using her expert skills from working in the meat factory, she proceeded to skin John from his neck all the way down to his toe. And she was so good at it that she was able to skin him in one piece. And she took this skin suit and she draped it over the entrance to this closet. And then she removed John's head from the now skinned torso and she placed it in the water that she had put on to boil earlier. She was going to use his head to turn it into some sort of broth or gravy. And then she grabbed his skinned torso and dragged it into the kitchen and began butchering it and then making different dishes with his meat, different pies and casseroles. And then after she had made this enormous feast out of John's body, she set the food all around the table that she had already laid out, and then she made little placards, little name cards that had the names of each of John's children on them, and she placed them in front of each of the plates because her intention was to feed them their father. And then Catherine sat down at a plate that she had made for herself and she began eating John, except it made her sick, and so she opened the window behind her and she threw her plate of food out into the backyard. And then when she turned back around and looked at what she had done, she decided that instead of facing the consequences, she would just take her own life. And so she went into the bathroom, she grabbed some sleeping pills, and then she cut across the front of the house, walking through that pool of blood near the door. She made her way into the living room, she overdosed on sleeping pills, and collapsed on the ground. However, when the paramedics finally showed up the following morning, they were able to save her. And so once she stabilized in the hospital, she was promptly arrested for John's murder. She would ultimately be found guilty, however, she would never take any responsibility. And then during her sentencing phase, she was given life in prison, but the judge made a special clause just for her. He told them that her file needed to be stamped, literally stamped, never to be released. Basically, there was no hope ever of her getting out of prison. And so after she was taken away, she would become the first woman in Australian history to be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She is still alive today.